And now it's time for news from around the world in Meanwhile In. Meanwhile, in the Marshall Islands, we're seeing a consequence of climate change I don't think anyone predicted, but we have to go back just a little bit, some quick history to get us to the point that we're in right now. Between 1946 and 1958, the US detonated 67 nuclear bombs on, in, and above the Marshall Islands, vaporizing whole islands, carving craters into shallow lagoons, and exiling hundreds of people from their homes. Now, after it finished nuking the island dozens and dozens of times, the Pentagon dropped biological weapons, mixing it up. Once the US was finished, it scooped up that soil, poured it into a crater left behind from a nuclear detonation, mixed it with concrete, and covered the whole thing in a concrete dome that they called it the tomb. So at that point, we were good, right? But unfortunately, climate change is breaking that dome open because rising sea levels are starting to flood it. It's cracking, and now nuclear waste is spreading into the Pacific Ocean. Michael Brooks, nobody could have predicted it.
Nobody could have predicted it, and I heard the stat recently. I believe that no country has had more of those weapons dropped on it than the United States.
We should look into who did it.
Yeah, we got to figure out what the hell is going on.
67 times.
67 times.
It's insane.
I mean, it is absolutely insane, and it's also another micro example of colonialism. You guys are going to have to leave. Because we're going to liquidate your island.
Yeah, and by the way, so we're talking about the nuclear waste that's leaking out now. That's a disaster. It's going to continue to be a disaster, but it was already a disaster before the dome started to crack, because even the people who moved away, in some cases, didn't move far enough, and they've been experiencing the effects of that radiation ever since. Birth defects are so common that people have a number of words to describe them, among them marlins, devils, jellyfish children, and grape babies for the particular clusters of symptoms from the radiation-caused birth defects. So even before the crack, that's what our government did to these people because they happened to live in an island chain that we thought would be convenient to drop some bombs on. Now, we have a related story actually, Meanwhile In. All around the world in our global war on terror, this time not using nukes, thankfully, it is still costing a lot in dollars and lives. The war on terror launched by the US government in the wake of the September 11th attacks has cost at least 801,000 lives and cost $6.4 trillion, according to new pair of reports, a new estimate. I have heard estimates before that were quite high. This is the highest. And we just pretend that it was a rough war, but you know what? If we have to continue forever in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, maybe it's necessary.
It's the framework, right? I mean, we had the Cold War, then in the 1990s, we looked for a new sort of like macro understanding of the world that could, basically justify US imperial hegemon. And we had this humanitarian intervention phase, which was a disaster.
Like all throughout the 90s.
It was all throughout the 90s, and then it fused together in 2001 with on one hand, we have to go and lay waste to the world because of a specific small terrorist group. And then on the other hand, somehow we can also be like the bomber wing of human rights. And it still goes on. I mean, we are under Trump's civilian rate casualties are skyrocketing. Obama, of course, codified and expanded the covert aspects of the war. And it is still the framework that governs how we do foreign policy and fused very much with Israeli policy in Gaza.
Yeah, and by the way, as high as that estimate is, and that's insane, horrifying, the actual numbers are likely far higher.
Absolutely.
The civilian death toll across all regions is up to 335,000, nearly 42% of the total figure. But the report doesn't include indirect deaths, namely those caused by loss of access to food, water, infrastructure, war-related disease, all things that tend to be caused by wars. And some experts who study this say that indirect deaths are estimated to be about 4 times higher than direct deaths. So there you are talking about the likelihood that millions of additional people were killed thanks to this war on terror.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
So horrifying news, but with that we are going to turn to a slightly different story. Meanwhile in. Meanwhile in Bolivia, and never has that image fit the story less, but we're gonna proceed. We're in the aftermath of this.
I'm sorry.
We have them for a lot of stories, and sometimes it fits, sometimes not so much. Scotland's got a goat in it. Sometimes that's appropriate. Anyway, so I've lost my train of thought. So look, Michael,
Yes.
I wanted you to talk about Bolivia and what's going on there right now. There's a lot of, I would say, information and misinformation coming out. We're seeing takes from the US government. I saw a headline that was US pleased with developments in Bolivia, and I thought, maybe speak for yourself on that, but.
I would say that's a very, yeah, I mean, US government, that's an accurate headline. Last weekend was a major event in Latin America. I mean, you had the release of political prisoner Lula da Silva in Brazil, and that had has huge ramifications. And then there was a coup in Bolivia. And in such a short period of time, I guess I'll just say 2 quick points. One, let's be really precise and pedantic. It's a coup, regardless of what you think of Morales. If the military says, we would like you to leave, that's called a coup.
And he is currently in Mexico City.
Exile, and by the way, fleeing like neo-fascist paramilitaries that wanted to kill him. The second point is, and this is what happens a lot, is that people expect complete purity from governments operating in the periphery under a lot of pressures. Morales lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and to the extent there was legitimate criticisms of his government from the left, all of those things are gonna be subsumed by what is at the end of the day a far-right movement that hates indigenous people and is aligned with US interests. So there's a lot more subtleties to tease out, but it's important to recognize that. 1, it's a coup. 2, if you have legitimate concerns about Morales, don't be a naive fool about what this actually means from an ecological or an indigenous rights perspective. Now,
and really
social
fast
movements,
on that,
yeah, sorry.
On that, like if you have concerns about how the election was handled or something like that, we've had elections here that are contested. You have an investigation. You don't run the candidate out of the country.
And for what it's worth, the opposition said even before, we'll contest it, but we're gonna protest no matter what. For me, the Center for Economic and Budget Priorities put out a really good analysis of this. I'll have the former Ecuadorian foreign minister on my show next week to talk about it. I think, frankly, him winning 47% in terms of the geography of the country and where it came from makes, like, I believe those numbers. Now,
well, and
again,
apparently polling leading up to the election basically got the numbers pretty well.
Yeah, he basically got the numbers pretty well. But the bottom line is, is that 1, it's bratty and delusional to expect perfection from any leader, let alone one in a place like Bolivia. And 2, he accomplished a lot of things, and to the extent the project was failing or running into speed bumps and contradictions, if you think that this, a right-wing movement, almost certainly empowered by the United States, would be my guess, is going to improve upon the ecology of the Amazon or the rights of indigenous people or workers, I have a demo tape and a real estate opportunity. Hit me up on Twitter.
Yeah, and the likely coming threat to the indigenous community, that's one of the scariest parts of this. I mean, there were some quotes that came out initially, really scary, and seeing that at the same time that Jair Bolsonaro is like, he's got it in for these people. We've seen
Argentina
murders.
and Brazil through the sort of like big cattle ranch and mining interests, they're definitely involved in that as well. And Lula centered that, and it's very serious times in Latin America.
Yeah. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.